The hidden cost of always being the strong person. The people who never fall apart are usually the ones falling apart the most quietly. You've noticed this, maybe in yourself. The way you can hold a room together while something in you is fraying at the edges, and no one asks if you're okay, because you've never given them a reason to ask. This isn't an accident. It's a role you stepped into so long ago that you mistook it for your personality. Psychologists call this trait the self-reliant defense, a learned pattern where competence becomes a shield and being needed becomes safer than being known. What you're about to hear isn't about weakness. It's about the version of you that disappeared the day you decided you'd never be a burden again. This pattern often begins in childhood, in homes where emotional need was met with silence, dismissal, or reversal, where a child learned, sometimes before they could even name it, that their job was to manage other people's feelings rather than express their own. Developmental psychologists call this parentification, a role reversal that trains the nervous system to associate safety with control and usefulness rather than connection. Over time, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for planning and self-regulation, becomes highly skilled at suppression, while the amygdala stays quietly primed for threat, because vulnerability was never modeled as safe. The result is a person who can manage a crisis without flinching, but who has lost the architecture for being held. The first sign is that you've become fluent in a particular kind of silence, the one where you absorb bad news, sit with it for exactly long enough to look composed, and then immediately ask the other person if they're okay. From the inside, it doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like instinct, automatic, almost polite, your attention redirecting before your own reaction has even finished forming. This is what psychologists studying emotional labor call affect deflection, a learned reflex where the nervous system treats your own distress as a problem to be managed quietly rather than a signal to be expressed. In practice, this shows up in the way friends call you in their worst moments and somehow never think to call when you're in yours. Not because they don't care, but because you've never given them the data. You've become so good at catching what falls that no one has noticed you're still standing under all of it. The second sign is that rest feels vaguely illegal. Not forbidden exactly, just unearned, like something you'd need to justify if anyone asked. From the inside, stillness produces a low static of unease, a sense that something is being neglected even when nothing is. So you fill the quiet with one more task, one more thing checked off, because productivity has become the only state in which you feel allowed to exist. This traces back to what's sometimes called contingent self-worth, a psychological pattern where your sense of value isn't stable but conditional, tethered tightly to output and usefulness rather than to simply being. So your evenings fill with tasks no one assigned you, your vacations come with a laptop just in case, and even your leisure starts to look suspiciously like labor. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being able to tell the difference between resting and disappearing. The third sign is a quiet, persistent discomfort with receiving help, even when it's offered freely and without conditions. From the inside, it doesn't register as pride. It registers as exposure, a flush of something close to panic when someone says, "Let me take care of that for you," as though being helped requires you to hand over a piece of control you're not sure you'll get back. This connects to what attachment researchers describe as compulsive self-reliance, a strategy formed early on when depending on others proved unreliable or even dangerous. So the mind quietly rewrote the rules. If you need nothing, you can be disappointed by no one. In your adult relationships, this looks like waving off offers reflexively, insisting you've got it, even when you clearly don't, and feeling a strange grief afterward. Not because the help didn't come, but because some small part of you wanted to say yes and didn't know how. You've built a life where you're remarkably safe from being let down, and remarkably alone in that safety. The fourth sign is that you've started to anticipate other people's needs before they've spoken them, scanning a room the way some people scan for exits, automatically, constantly, without being asked to. From the inside, it can feel like empathy, even like a gift. But underneath it, there's often a current of low-grade vigilance. Your attention never fully at rest, because some part of you is always monitoring the emotional weather of everyone around you. This is consistent with what's sometimes called hypervigilant attunement, a nervous system adaptation where a person becomes so skilled at reading others that they lose track of reading themselves. The outward-facing radar, running so constantly, it crowds out the inward signal. In practice, you're the one who notices the shift in someone's tone before they've said a word, who adjusts your own mood to smooth a room you didn't even realize was tense. And afterward, when someone asks how you are, there's a strange pause, because you genuinely don't know. You've spent so long fluent in everyone else's interior weather that your own has gone quiet from disuse. Here's the part worth pausing on, because by now you might be assembling a quiet verdict against yourself, that you're broken, or too guarded, or somehow built wrong. You're not. What's been described so far isn't a flaw in your character. It's evidence of a mind that, at some point, solved an impossible problem. A child who learns to read a room before it turns dangerous, who learns to need nothing so nothing can be taken away, who learns to carry weight so the people around them don't have to. That child wasn't weak. That child was resourceful in a way most adults never have to be. Psychologists sometimes call this adaptive intelligence under constraint, the mind doing exactly what it should do when safety is conditional, building a self that could survive an environment that didn't leave room for softness. The strength you're so tired of carrying was never a personality flaw. It was a solution. The exhaustion you feel now isn't proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that the solution worked for far longer than it should have had to. The sixth sign is that you've quietly stopped believing anyone could carry something for you, even if they wanted to. Not because they've failed you necessarily, but because some early version of you decided the math doesn't work, that the relief of being held would never outweigh the risk of being disappointed. From the inside, this feels less like distrust and more like a strange, low fog over your closest relationships. You can be deeply loved and still feel like you're standing slightly outside of it, watching rather than fully inside the warmth. This pattern reflects what relational psychologists describe as intimacy ceiling, a learned limit on how much closeness a person allows themselves to receive, regardless of how much is actually offered. In your real relationships, this might look like a partner who says, "I'm here for whatever you need," and you believing them, intellectually, while some older part of you still keeps a private inventory of everything you haven't told them. You are loved by people who would carry you if you let them. And the saddest part isn't that they can't. It's that you've never fully tested whether they would. The seventh sign is the one that surfaces latest and cuts deepest. A quiet, persistent fear that if you ever stopped being strong, even briefly, people would not stay to find out who you are underneath it. From the inside, this isn't dramatic. It's a small, constant calculation running beneath every interaction. How much can I show? How much is too much? What happens if I let this crack show in front of them? This is rooted in what attachment theory calls conditional belonging, the belief, often formed long before language, that love and presence were never unconditional, but earned through usefulness, and could be withdrawn the moment you stopped performing it. In your life now, this might surface in the moments you almost say, "I'm not okay," and then change the subject. Or the relationships where you're endlessly trusted with everyone else's collapse, but have never once tested whether yours would be met with the same patience. The hardest part of carrying this fear isn't the carrying. It's wondering, somewhere quiet and rarely spoken aloud, whether you were ever loved for who you are, or only for what you could hold. You were never asked if you wanted to be the strong one. It was simply handed to you, early enough that it felt less like a choice and more like a fact about who you are. But a role you were given is not the same as a self you chose. So maybe the question isn't how much longer you can carry this. Maybe it's smaller and quieter and harder to answer. Who would you be if no one needed you to be strong tonight? If any of this sounds familiar, you're exactly who this channel is for. Rewired is about understanding the patterns running underneath your life, so you can finally choose them instead of just living inside them. Subscribe to @RewiredSci, and let's keep going deeper, one video at a time. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, experiences, or reflections. Your perspective may help someone else feel understood. Like, share, and subscribe to join future conversations about the mind, behavior, relationships, and the psychology behind who we become.